So boil this whole rethinking religion deconstruction project down to its essence. And here's what we find. Religion is going through a major shift from believing doctrines to finding deeper experience. There's a term that you hear all the time. I use it all the time. The stories we tell ourselves. Because our stories impact our lives powerfully. Our stories determine what we look for and what we don't look for, and therefore what we find and what we don't find. Our stories determine what kind of experiences we will have and what kind of experiences we don't have, and few stories are as deterministic of the experiences we have or don't have as our stories about God. The word God is a code word for ultimacy. It's code for the biggest reality that we can imagine, bigger than we can contain the eternity part that we carry in our hearts. So that makes this an important video for how we talk to our kids. How do we talk about God? Now, folks who do talk about God usually have a human-shaped image in their minds. That's just how our brains work. We compare a thing we don't know to a thing we do. We anthropomorphize God usually as our Father who art in heaven, or maybe God as judge, or God as king, sometimes God as mother, but most commonly our Father who art in heaven. I told a story in the book about a 7-year-old girl in our community who had been diagnosed with Crohn's disease. And coming to grips with how that was going to change her life, she one day asked her mom, "Why would God do this to me?" That's a tough question, so Mom brought her to talk to the preacher guy. You can read the story. I hope that I spoke in age-appropriate words. I think I did. But the essence of what I said was this. Sweetie, we just cannot answer that question. Not as long as in our heads we think God is our Father in heaven. Because if God is that, he is a terrible father. What kind of father would stand by and let this happen to his child? You've probably heard somebody along the way rejecting God, but doing it in these patriarchal terms. Why would all-powerful God in heaven allow Rwandan genocide or Jewish Holocaust or little girls with Crohn's disease? Lots of problems when we imagine God shaped like a human. But in our tradition, we certainly have done that. And we have imagined God that way. There's lots of human-shaped words about God in the Bible. But we've also said in our tradition, yeah, don't do that. Don't imagine God as a human. Some words we've used to say that when we say don't talk about that God that way is transcendence or ineffability or uncontainable or the unknowable unknown. You might have heard about the commandments in the Jewish scriptures. Don't make a statue of God or draw a picture of God. Don't even say the word God. Take all the vowels out so that you make it unpronounceable, because if you say the word or if you carve the image, you fool yourself into thinking you know what you're talking about. And none of us do, and none of us ever will. So, God is not our Father in heaven, as cherished as that metaphor may be. God is not policeman in the sky. God is not judge and jury watching over our deeds. Those are imperfect metaphors that helped us on one part of our journey experience one little sliver of the uncontainable, to catch one little glimpse of what cannot be seen, to know one little bit of what cannot be known, which turns out was not bad. It's really, really good, because the spiritual journey is a quest for experience. And those metaphors did drive many people's very good experience. And that's experience we want for our kids. We also don't want them to get locked into any experience. We don't want them locked into any partial, incomplete, imperfect metaphor about God, because partial, incomplete, imperfect will confine them and limit them, but more, eventually it'll start to do serious harm to them. As I'm doing these videos right now, Christian nationalism is perverting the very foundation of everything Jesus taught in our nation. At the center of that harmful experience is an assumption that we know what God wants. We know who God likes. We know who God doesn't like. We want our children to access many metaphors for God, and for a time, parental metaphors or authority figure metaphors can be helpful. But at some point, that stops being helpful. And we don't want them stuck in any metaphor when their brains ready them to move on to more fruitful metaphors, usually in their late adolescence. There's beautiful experience to be had mining those human-shaped metaphors for God. But there's also stagnation to be had. There is also harm to be had if we stay there. We want our kids to be able to shift metaphors easily. Once the father metaphor stops calling them to trust or to depend on or to feel safe, when it starts driving them away from spiritual experience, we want them to be able to shift. Now, here's the thing. Our tradition has always given us permission to do that. When our spiritual ancestors found any concept for God too constricting, they just abandoned it. They got another one. I used to surprise folks, given that I am the preacher guy. Yeah, you know what I think you need? I think you need a new God. Yeah, that surprised folks. You know what I think? I think you need to trade that God in, get you a new one. In our tradition, the concept of God has always been flexible enough to allow us to do that. We adapt our story again and again and again, always drawing us as we explore new metaphors into deeper experiences of the divine. We want that for our children. So, how do we talk to our kids about God? Well, I use a phrase you may want to use as well. When we imagine God, or that's a wonderful way to imagine God, or that's so helpful, imagining God that way, without making a big deal of it, we let our kids know all we ever have are ways to imagine God. We don't have anything definitive. We don't have an absolute understanding of what God is. Now, they're young, so they're concrete, especially the young ones, so we don't need to give them a dissertation on transcendence. They need to be affirmed in whatever way they are imagining God. Oh, that is wonderful, honey. When you imagine God that way, it really helps you look at this way or see that thing. We give our kids permission to imagine. And if parental images are how they imagine, that's a great way, honey. Authority figures, oh, that's so helpful. Concrete ways, oh, that's great. What a great way to think about God. That sure was helpful for me when I was young too. I'm glad that that's helpful for you too. Also though, and not at the same time, we expose them to other ways to imagine God. Again, lots about this in the book, but you know, sweetie, it's been really helpful for me to imagine God like the wind. We take a box outside on a windy day and we try and capture the wind. We just can't. We can't put wind in a box, but we can feel wind blow us. While we can't contain God in our minds, we can, in the same way that we can experience wind blowing a sailboat, we can imagine God moving us like that. When they get a little older, we can have even more abstract ideas. I like to imagine God like soil. In our tradition, we've called that way of imagining God the ground of all being. I like to imagine that we are trees planted in soil. See how that tree gets everything it needs from the dirt? I like to think of me like that and God like the dirt. We can't not be in dirt and still be a tree. We can't not be in God and God in us and still be us. Or one of my favorites, I like to imagine God like music, like a song. And the song plays whether I dance to it or not. The downbeat of this song, the fruit of the Spirit, love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and courage and justice and fairness, virtue. Now, I can decide to dance with that song, or I can decide to dance to a different song. I can dance to the hate song when somebody hurts me. I can dance to the worry song when my brain gets all anxious. I can dance to the Be Mean song when somebody is mean to me. But I can also dance the God song whenever I want to. I can dance the love, joy, and peace and patience song. So, I hope that we expose our children to many age-appropriate metaphors for God, many ways to imagine God so that they can configure their lives in response to many different metaphors. Some God metaphors help us learn duty, responsibility to others. That's helpful. Others metaphors help us explore the deepest longings of our hearts. There are many ways to explore ultimacy, and we want to give our kids all of them. So there's a couple metaphors you hear in our community all the time. God is an indwelling light that guides us from within. God is an inner voice that we hear in the quietness and the whispers. Experiential metaphors that invite us to experience. So again, God cannot be understood. God cannot be contained, but God can be experienced. We can experience the interior nudges, the inner insights, the inner longings emerging from our divine centers, our truest selves. Let's give the full complement of metaphors to our kids. Let them have God for a lifetime. That's how we talk about God with our kids.